I'm John, 73.
Please.
Please listen to me.
The mug went cold in my hands as I sat at the kitchen window, watching the December snow slowly blanket the backyard. This was the house I'd been living in for 2 years now, ever since the damn stroke took me down. 73 is an age when I still feel moored in someone else's harbor. Eric bought this house in Maple Grove 5 years ago when he married Caroline. Back then, I lived in my apartment in the Harbor District amidst the smells of salt and machine oil. After the stroke, things had changed. My left arm still wasn't working properly, although the doctors said it wasn't bad for my age. "John, you didn't clean up the dishes again?" Caroline's voice cut through the morning silence like a siren in the fog. I turned around. She was standing at the sink in her pink robe, holding my plate from last night. Her hair was in a tight bun, her face disgruntled. "Sorry, Caroline. I forgot to wash it last night." "I forgot." She put the plate in the dishwasher with excessive harshness. "You forget something every day. The dishes, the bathroom light, the crumbs on the table." I got up, walked over to the sink, and started scrubbing the mug. The movements were slow. My left hand was still not working at full strength. "I can clean up after myself." "Of course you can," she said with the same patience one would use to explain something to a particularly stupid sailor. "The question is whether you do it." Caroline worked as a pharmacist for her parents' company. A good job, as Eric never tired of saying. She and her father had started a pharmaceutical company 20 years ago, and now they had 3 pharmacies in the city. Caroline was proud to say that she was about to get a promotion and a share in the business. "Where's Eric?" "On call." Mrs. Hunter called at 6 a.m. Her cat had a stomach bug. Eric was a veterinarian, owned his own clinic. Good son, caring, but a little too soft, like his mother, God rest her soul. Sarah never raised her voice, even when I came home after months of traveling. She died 4 years ago of cancer, and at the time I'd felt like a part of me had died with her. Caroline pulled a yogurt out of the fridge and sat down at the table across from me. She always sat across from me, like she was controlling my movements. The phone rang in the living room, and a minute later Caroline shouted, "John, it's for you." I made my way into the living room. Caroline handed me the receiver with an expression of mild displeasure. "John Woodworth." "Captain, how are you, old sea wolf?" Tom Blackwell's voice immediately took me back 20 years. Tom was a mechanic on my last boat. "Tom, where are you calling from?" "Seattle. Listen, there's some old wolves getting together for New Year's Eve festivities. Remember Jerry Campbell and Rick Stone? Everybody's coming. Why don't you come?" "I don't know, Tom. It's not a good time." "December 31st. The old Anchor. Remember that bar?" "Come on, Captain. We miss you." Caroline walked past with a basket of laundry, throwing me a look of impatience. "I'll think about it." "All right. Don't let me down, Captain." I hung up the phone. Caroline stopped at the stairs. "Who was that?" "A former co-worker. He wants to meet." "When?" "I know. December 31st. "I see. Well, that's after Christmas." She sounded relieved. She went upstairs and the house was quiet again. Eric came home at 7 in the evening, tired but satisfied. The operation had been a success. "How are you?" he asked. "I'm fine." "Is Mrs. Hunter's cat gonna make it?" "He would." He washed his hands, took the rest of last night's roast out of the fridge. "You want some lunch?" Sure." We sat down at the table, and I felt the tension recede. I felt at ease with my son, like when I was at sea, among a reliable crew. "Daddy, do you remember when we used to make the Christmas table?" "Of course I do. Mom always had us cooking. You chop the vegetables, I'd help set the table. Those were good times." "Yeah," he said quietly. "You know, Dad, sometimes I think we should do more. You know, do things together. Like we used to." Caroline prefers to do things on her own. "I know she does. She's very, independent. But this is our family and you're an important part of it." Those words warmed me more than all the coffee in the morning. Eric really cared, wanted me to be happy. "Thank you for saying that." "It's the truth, Dad. And if there's anything wrong, make sure you tell me. We'll work it out." But I knew I wouldn't. I wouldn't put my son in a difficult position, make him choose between his wife and his father. We finished lunch and Eric looked at his watch. "I have to go to the clinic. We'll talk more about holiday plans tonight, okay? Okay, son. He hugged me goodbye, a big, real hug. And I realized that despite all the difficulties, I had the most important thing, my son's love. I spent the rest of the day thinking about how my life had changed over the past 2 years. I used to command a crew of 20 people, making decisions that depended on the safety of millions of dollars worth of cargo. Now I'm asked to be quiet so I don't interfere with household chores. But there was nothing to complain about. I have a roof over my head, a caring son, food on the table, and most importantly, I'm not alone. Sometimes you just want to feel needed, important, and not a burden, which is tolerated out of a sense of duty. The next day began with the rumble of the vacuum cleaner at 7 in the morning. I woke up to the sound and lay in bed for a while, listening to Caroline methodically working every corner of the living room. She always cleaned with a special fervor before my parents arrived, as if she were preparing for a fleet commander's inspection. When I went down to the kitchen, I found a note on the table, written in Caroline's neat handwriting. John, it's cleanup day. Try not to get in the way. Grocery list is on the fridge. Go to the store this afternoon. Caroline, no, please, no, if it's not too much trouble. Just instructions, like a sailor from a senior mate. I glanced at the list pinned to the refrigerator door with an anchor-shaped magnet, a gift from Eric for my birthday last year. A long list of delicacies, French cheese, Spanish ham, artichokes, 3 varieties of olives, a certain brand of champagne. The vacuum cleaner went silent, and a minute later Caroline came into the kitchen, dressed in homemade clothes but already fully assembled, hair done, makeup applied. Even at home, she looked like she was expecting important visitors. John, you're up. I'm good. We've got a lot to catch up on. Saw the list. It's pretty impressive. Parents are used to a certain level. She opened a cabinet, pulled out some cleaning supplies. You'll need to go to Harrison's Market on Main Street. They have everything on the list. Harrison's Market was an expensive gourmet grocery store in the center of town, where ordinary people shopped unless it was a special birthday party. Caroline shopped there regularly, especially when she needed to impress. Can I borrow the car? Sure, just be careful. And don't forget the receipts. I keep a record of all expenses. She always wrote down her expenses, keeping her household books with the meticulousness of an accountant for a large corporation. Every purchase was put in a special notebook, every receipt saved. Eric said it helped with budgeting, but it seemed to me that Caroline just liked to control every dime she spent. And while you were at the store, I'll tidy up the guest room. The guest room was next to my bedroom. Usually the door was closed, but sometimes I could hear Caroline rearranging things in there, airing things out, changing linens. She treated that room with special care, like a showcase for her household. Maybe there's something I can do to help with the cleaning? Caroline pulled away from studying the label on the bottle of detergent and looked at me with the expression one looks at when a child offers to help with a serious adult task. Thanks, John, but I'd rather not. I have a system, and, well, I knew. A system meant that everything had to stand in a certain place. Every surface had to shine a certain way. My involvement could disrupt that system, wreak havoc on its carefully constructed order. All right, when's the best time to go to the store? After 2, I'll be done with the basic cleaning by then. Eric left for work before 7. He had a complicated case, an operation on a dog that had swallowed a toy. He quickly drank his coffee, kissed his wife goodbye, and waved me off. In his absence, the atmosphere in the house became more tense, as if the buffer between Caroline and me was disappearing. I went into the living room with a cup of coffee, intending to read the paper, but found all the furniture moved, the rug rolled up, and Caroline washing the windows with the tenacity of a person preparing for an important presentation. John, she said without turning around, can you stay in your room for a while? I need to work here. In your room, not in the bedroom or upstairs, but in your room, as you would say to a child who was interfering with important adult business. I nodded and went upstairs, feeling like an exile in my own home. My room was at the end of the second-floor hallway. It wasn't a bad room, with a window to the courtyard and a built-in closet. Eric had picked out the furniture himself when I moved in. A comfortable bed, a reading chair, a small table. A few pictures of my ships and family snapshots hung on the walls. Still, it wasn't my room in the full sense. It was the room I'd been assigned. I sat down in a chair, opened a book I'd been reading for a few days now, the memoirs of a merchant marine captain who sailed in the 60s. It was interesting reading, but it was hard to concentrate. From downstairs came the sounds of intensive cleaning, the noise of a vacuum cleaner, the clatter of moving furniture, the clinking of dishes. Around noon, everything quieted down. I went downstairs and saw the results of Caroline's work. The living room was sparkling clean, every surface polished to a shine, the air smelling of lemon freshener. The sofa cushions lay at precise angles. The magazines on the coffee table were fan-arranged with mathematical precision. "Impressive," I said, genuinely admiring her diligence. My parents were used to order. Caroline wiped her hands with a towel, inspecting the results of her work. Everything in their house is always spotless. I remembered Caroline's parents' house, a large mansion in an upscale neighborhood where every room looked like a page out of an interior design magazine. Even the air felt polished, and the furniture looked like it had been arranged on a ruler. "Why don't we have lunch together?" I suggested it. I don't have time for long lunches, John. I still have to do the kitchen, then the guest room." She looked at her watch. "I'll make myself a salad, eat as I go." Caroline walked to the kitchen, pulled a container of cooked greens, a can of tuna, and tomatoes from the refrigerator. Movements quick, efficient, no unnecessary gestures. Even the food was just the fuel she needed to keep working. I made myself a ham sandwich and sat down at the table. Caroline ate standing by the window, occasionally glancing out into the yard, as if checking to see if everything was all right. "John, by the way," she said, not taking her eyes off the salad, "tomorrow when your parents come, you'd better, well, try to listen more than you talk." "What do you mean?" "I mean, my parents aren't really, how can I put this? Really interested in sea stories. They're practical people. They like to talk about current affairs, business, future plans, current affairs, business, future plans. All things I had nothing to do with in my current life. I was a man of the past, a living reminder of a time that had passed." "I understand. And one more small request." She turned to me, and in her eyes was the determination of a man preparing to say something unpleasant but necessary. "Maybe you could, have dinner earlier? Or in your room. It's just that my parents are used to quiet family dinners, and you sometimes, well, you drop your food a little bit, or you cough. That's it." She wanted me to disappear not only from the living room, but also from the dinner table, so my parents wouldn't see an old man with trembling hands trying to get his spoon to his mouth to see if he choked on anything while eating. I try to eat carefully. "Of course you do. It's just, after your stroke, sometimes you have—" She didn't finish the sentence, but it made sense. "After the stroke, my hand did shake sometimes. Not a lot, but it was noticeable, especially when I was nervous or tired. The doctor said it would go away, but for now it was a reality I had to live with." "Okay, Caroline. I'll know when it's best not to show up. Thank you for understanding." She sounded relieved to have solved an unpleasant problem. "It's only for 3 days, just 3 days." She spoke as if it were a minor inconvenience, like a home repair or a water shutoff. I nodded and finished my sandwich in silence. After lunch, Caroline went upstairs to do the guest room, and I stayed in the kitchen to do the dishes. A simple task, but it made me feel useful, able to contribute at least a little to the household. As I was wiping the plates, the phone rang. The voice on the receiver was unfamiliar, a middle-aged woman who identified herself as the secretary of the Harrison Pharmaceutical Company. "Mr. Woodworth? It's about the Christmas bonus for Caroline. Mr. Harrison would like to clarify some details." "Caroline's upstairs. I'll get her for you." Thank you." I went up to the guest room. The door was open, and I could see Caroline changing the linens, carefully smoothing every crease. Snow-white sheets, fluffed pillows, fresh towels. It looked like an expensive hotel. "Caroline, phone call for you, from your parents' company." "About the bonus, I guess." She set aside the bedspread. "I'll go." I stayed in the hallway, absently listening to her conversation coming from downstairs. Caroline was talking about numbers, percentages, plans for next year. Her voice had the confidence of a person discussing important matters with her peers. When she returned, there was a satisfied expression on her face. Good news? Very good news. My parents have decided to increase my bonus by 20%, and they're promising a stake in the company by the end of next year. A stake in the company? It meant financial independence, the ability to make big decisions. It was something Caroline had always wanted, and now it was almost there. Congratulations. Thank you. She went back to the bed, began to adjust the covers. You know, John, sometimes I think about how quickly things change. 5 years ago, I was just a pharmacist in a drugstore. And now you're practically a partner in the family business. Yeah, and that opens up a lot of opportunities. For me, for Eric, for our family. Our family. There's that expression again, the one where I wasn't sure there was room for me. Caroline continued to work on the bed, but I could see she was thinking about something. John, can you sit down? I want to talk to you. I sat down in the chair by the window. I could tell by my tone that this was going to be a serious conversation. About what? About plans. How we see the future of this family. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap. The posture of a businesswoman preparing for an important negotiation. You know Eric and I want children. I'm 34, and time is of the essence. I know, Eric told me. Kids are going to need more space, more attention. This house is nice, but, well, it's not infinite. I was starting to see where she was going with this. Kids, more space, the need for change. And an old man occupying one of the bedrooms didn't fit into those plans. I thought it might be worth considering alternatives for your living arrangements. What alternatives? Well, there are some very nice homes for the elderly, with medical care, social programs, places where people your age feel comfortable amongst their peers, homes for the elderly. She made it sound like she was suggesting a move to a resort hotel, but I knew what it was. Institutionalized care, a schedule set by others, living among people united only by age and infirmity. Does Eric know about your thoughts? We've discussed it. He understands the practicalities of the issue, but, well, it's hard for him to make a decision. He's very attached to you. Eric is attached to me. So the only obstacle to her plans was a sentimental son who couldn't send his father to a nursing home out of a sense of duty. I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, John. It's just, circumstances change. And sometimes you have to make the hard but right decisions. The right decisions? The right decisions for who? For her? For their future children? For the family she was modeling? I was a detail that didn't fit the big picture. I need time to think. Of course you do. No one's rushing me. She got up, went back to her business. Just wanted you to know our thoughts. Our thoughts? I wondered if they were really Eric's thoughts, or if she was just presenting the case that way. At 2 in the afternoon, I grabbed my car keys and drove to the store. The drive downtown took 20 minutes. I had to drive slowly because of the snowfall. Harrison's Market was in a historic building on Main Street, with windows decorated for Christmas. Inside, it smelled of expensive cheeses and fresh-baked goods. The customers were mostly middle-aged men in expensive clothes, studying the labels on $100 bottles of wine. I felt out of place here, like a sailor at an admiral's reception. Caroline's list was detailed. Certain types of cheese, specific brands of olives, champagne from a French producer with a hard-to-pronounce name. The salespeople were polite and professional, but I could see their appreciation of my plain clothes and uncertainty about the delicacies. At the cash register, a girl punched in items for an amount that made me wince. With that money, you could feed your family for an entire week. But Caroline gave me a credit card and told me not to worry about the cost. Beautiful shopping, the cashier said as she bagged the items. Getting ready for the holiday? Yes, the relatives are coming. I understand. It's important to make a good impression. It's important to make a good impression. That's what Caroline was all about. For her parents to see a successful daughter, a perfect wife, the owner of a spotless house, and an old man with trembling hands didn't fit into that picture. On the way home, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Caroline, about the nursing homes, about the plans for the future, about the children that were going to change this family's life. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to admit that my role in my son's life had changed, that I was no longer the right person to fully participate in the family's affairs. But admitting it was painful, like admitting that your ship was no longer fit for the long haul and it was time to scrap it. At home, Caroline accepted the purchases with the air of a general inspecting supplies before an important battle. Everything was just right. Everything met her requirements. She arranged the groceries in the refrigerator with the meticulousness of a man drawing up a battle plan. Thank you, John. Now I can prepare everything in advance. You're welcome. The rest of the day passed in an atmosphere of intense preparation. Caroline finished the guest room, started on the kitchen, then the bathroom that would be used by the guests. Every surface was scrubbed, polished, brought to museum-quality condition. Eric returned home at 7 in the evening, tired but satisfied. The operation had been a success. He inspected the results of his wife's labors with admiration, praised her diligence, thanked her for caring for the comfort of her parents. At dinner, Caroline talked about the plans for tomorrow, about meeting her parents at the airport, showing them the house, organizing a quiet family evening. Eric listened attentively, sometimes nodding, agreeing with her suggestions. I sat at the table and thought about the fact that tomorrow would be the beginning of 3 days, during which I would have to be invisible in my own home. 3 days that would show Caroline's parents how happy and successful their daughter had become. What a perfect home she had created with her husband. And I realized that my role in this play was to stay behind the scenes. The morning of December 23rd began with Caroline checking the house one last time. She went from room to room with a notebook in her hand, making notes, correcting things, rearranging items by millimeters. Her movements had the nervousness of a person before an important exam. Her parents were scheduled to arrive at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and every minute until their arrival was scheduled. Carolyn had planned the schedule as carefully as if she were planning a military operation. What time to pick them up from the airport, when to show them the house, what time to serve a light dinner, when it was best to offer them a rest from the road. I sat in the kitchen with my morning coffee, watching her whiz by with yet another list. This time it was about setting the table for tomorrow's Christmas dinner. She had already pulled out the ceremonial dishes and was wiping each plate down to a shine. John, she said without pausing, you'd better spend some time upstairs tonight. I want my parents to get settled in first, and then I want them to, well, familiarize themselves with the home environment. Domesticity was what she now called my presence in the house. Not a family member, not Eric's father, but an element of the interior that is better to show to guests not right away. Okay, chuckles. I understand. Thank you. She sounded relieved. It's really important to me. Eric left for work early, but promised to be back by 3 o'clock to go to the airport with his wife. At breakfast, he looked a little worried. Caroline's parents had always had a slightly overwhelming effect on him. They were successful people, used to a certain standard of living, and Eric tried to live up to their expectations. Dad, he said before he left, if you need anything today, just call the clinic. It'll be fine, son. I know. It's just, Caroline's parents can be a little formal, but they're good people. Formal is a diplomatic word to describe people who judge others by strict criteria of success and conformity. Charles Harrison built a pharmaceutical empire from scratch. His wife, Cynthia, came from a family of doctors, used to the company of educated and wealthy people. To them, a retired sea captain living in his son-in-law's house after a stroke was more of a sad necessity than a welcome relative. After Eric's departure, the house became a one-actor theater. Carolyn rehearsed her meeting with her parents, running through the phrases she would say as she showed them the renovated living room, the new dishes, her career successes. She was preparing to present them with a picture of her perfect life. Around noon, I went up to my room as promised. I had a clear view of the driveway and could watch the preparations without disturbing them. Caroline took the Christmas decorations that had been stored in the garage out into the yard. Garlands of lights, a wreath for the door, reindeer figures for the lawn. In a few hours, the house was transformed, looking like a picture from a Christmas card. At 2 o'clock, she changed into an elegant dark blue dress, did her hair, applied makeup. Looking in the hallway mirror, she practiced her smile several times. Warm, cordial, but not overly emotional. The smile of a successful daughter who had arranged everything in her life to the best of her ability. Eric returned exactly at 3, quickly changed into a suit, and they drove to the airport. The house was empty, but the tension that had been in the air all day hadn't gone anywhere. It thickened in the corners of the rooms, waiting for the host to return with the guests of honor. I went downstairs and walked through the rooms. Everything was spotless. Polished furniture, fresh flowers in vases, not a speck of dust on the surfaces. Caroline had achieved the effect she was aiming for. The house looked like a demonstration of successful family life. At 6:30, I heard the sound of cars in the driveway. I looked out the window and saw Eric helping an elegant couple in expensive coats out of the car. Charles Harrison looked as imposing as ever, a tall man with gray hair in the straight posture of a man accustomed to command. Cynthia was a graceful woman in a pearl necklace, held with the dignity of a society lady. Caroline greeted them with the same rehearsed smile, hugging them with care not to mess up her mother's hair. Eric was unloading luggage, several expensive suitcases and boxes of gifts. I went back to my room and closed the door. From downstairs came voices, laughter, the sounds of a tour of the house. Caroline was showing her parents the updates to the interior, talking about her plans for the future. In her voice was the pride of a homeowner who had achieved exactly the standard of living she had dreamed of. About an hour later, there was a quiet knock at my door. "Dad," came Eric's voice. "Can I come in?" I opened the door. My son was standing in the hallway, looking a little tired from having to keep up small talk. "How's it going? Are Caroline's parents settling in?" "Yeah, they're fine. They're happy with the house," complimenting Caroline on her housekeeping. He didn't talk for a while. "Listen, why don't you come down and say hello? They've been asking about you." Caroline asked me to stay out of the way the first day. "I know, but, well, they're family, and it'd be weird if you didn't show up at all." Eric was right. Completely ignoring the guests would look even worse than my awkward presence. Besides, Charles and Cynthia were always polite to me, even if they didn't show much warmth. "Oh, okay, I'll go say hello." We went down to the living room. Caroline's parents were sitting on the couch with glasses of wine, and she was telling them something about her success at work. When they saw me, they all turned in my direction. "Aha, John!" Charles stood up and shook my hand. "How are you? You look good." "Thanks, Charles. Welcome." Cynthia smiled politely but didn't stand up. She always kept a slight distance, like a society lady receiving lesser guests. "John, how is your health?" she asked in the tone one would use to inquire about the well-being of a distant acquaintance. "I'm fine. I'm recovering gradually." "That's good. At your age, it's important to take care of yourself." "At my age," she said it as if I was a profound old man who was long overdue to prepare for the end, although the difference between us was only a few years. "John, have a seat," Charles suggested. Caroline was just talking about her plans for next year. I sat down in the chair by the window. Caroline continued her story about her job, her prospects of getting a share in the company, her plans for expanding the business. Her parents listened with visible pleasure. Their daughter was achieving exactly the success they expected of her. "And Eric," Charles turned to his son-in-law, "how are things going at the clinic? Are you planning to expand?" "Not yet, but the clientele is growing. There is more work." "That's good. It is important to develop, not to stand still." The conversation was about plans, prospects, ambitions, about the future that this family was building together. I sat and listened, feeling like a spectator in a theater, where a play about people of a completely different world was being played out. "Caroline tells me you're planning on having children," Cynthia said, turning to Eric. "That's wonderful. At your age, it's time." "Yes, we're thinking about it," Eric said, glancing at his wife. "Children will change a lot of things in your life," Cynthia continued. "They'll require more space, more attention. But it's a wonderful time in a family's life. More space. I get the hint." The conversation about the children moved seamlessly into a discussion about the layout of the house, the possibilities of remodeling, the need to create comfort for the next generation. And in all of these plans, there was no room for an aging father occupying one of the bedrooms. "We're thinking of turning the guest room into a nursery," Caroline said. "It's in a good location, with a good view." "That's a great idea," agreed Cynthia. "Where would the guests stay?" "Well, guests are rare, but the children are a priority. They talked about the future arrangement of the house as if I were invisible, or as if my relocation was an already decided issue that just hadn't been publicized yet. Around 7, Caroline served a light dinner, salads, cold appetizers, white wine. Everything was exquisite and beautifully served. Her parents praised her culinary talents, noting how successfully she had organized the household. "Tomorrow is going to be a real dinner party," Caroline said. "I've ordered duck from the best restaurant in town, and I'll cook all of my dad's and mom's favorite dishes." "We really appreciate your efforts, dear," Charles replied. "You've created a beautiful home. A beautiful home. A house where every detail was thought out, every element serving to create the right impression. A house where there was no room for unnecessary people who could disturb the harmony of the picture." After dinner, the parents decided to rest from the road. Caroline escorted them to the guest room, showed them where everything was, said goodnight. Eric helped carry the luggage, cleared the table. As the guests disappeared upstairs, the atmosphere in the house lightened a little. Caroline took off her shoes and leaned back on the sofa with a glass of wine. "It went well," she said with satisfaction. "The parents are happy. They like the house." "You did a great job organizing everything," Eric agreed, sitting down next to his wife. "Tomorrow the most important thing is Christmas dinner. I want everything to be perfect." Perfect. The word sounded like an incantation in her mouth. Perfect house, perfect family, perfect impression of her parents. And I realized that there was just no room for me in that perfect picture. "John," Caroline turned to me, "tomorrow at dinner time. Maybe you could join us later? We're planning to start at 7, and you're, well, around 8? Sure. Thanks for understanding. Just want to make sure everything goes smoothly." I nodded and went up to my room. It was snowing outside the window, covering the world in white silence. Tomorrow would be Christmas, a family holiday, a time when people come together to celebrate the important moments in their lives. And I will spend this holiday as I am instructed, invisibly without interfering with the perfect picture of family happiness. Christmas dinner began at 7 o'clock in the evening, just as Caroline had planned. The table in the dining room was set with the solemnity of a royal banquet. Snow-white tablecloths, ceremonial dishes with gold borders, tall candles and silver candlesticks. In the center of the table was a roast duck surrounded by a garnish of roasted vegetables and cranberry sauce. Caroline looked flawless in a dark green dress that emphasized her figure and made the moment solemn. Her hair was arranged in an elegant style, her makeup applied with professional skill. She glowed with pleasure. At last she could demonstrate to her parents her ability to create the atmosphere of an exquisite home party. Charles and Cynthia Harrison sat on either side of the table opposite each other, like honored guests at a formal reception. Charles wore a dark suit with a tie to match his shirt, while Cynthia wore an elegant gray dress with a pearl necklace. They looked like they were posing for a picture in a successful lifestyle magazine. Eric sat next to his wife, occasionally glancing at his watch. He looked a little tense, as he always did in the presence of his father-in-law and mother-in-law. For him, these family dinners were more a test of expectations than an enjoyable pastime. I took a seat at the end of the table, away from the main group. Caroline sat me down as if I were a younger relative being allowed to attend an adult event. The same beautiful dishes and glasses were in front of me, but I felt like a guest being tolerated out of politeness. "My dears," Caroline began, raising her champagne glass, "I want to thank you for coming to share this celebration with us. It means a lot to me to have us together on such a special day." "Thank you, my dear, for a beautifully organized evening," Charles replied, also raising his glass. "You created a real festive atmosphere." We drank, and Caroline began to cut the duck with professional skill. Each piece was perfectly sliced, beautifully laid out on plates and complemented with vegetables. She served the dishes as if she worked in a top-class restaurant. The conversation at the table was about the plans for the next year, about the development of the family business, about Caroline's prospects in the company. Charles talked about new contracts, Cynthia about the travel plans they were going to take now that things were going so well in the company. "Caroline has proven to be a very promising employee," Charles said as he cut the meat. "Her analytical skills and understanding of the market exceeded my expectations." "She's always been smart," Cynthia added. "Even at school, her teachers had noted her aptitude for exact sciences." Caroline listened to her parents' praise with visible pleasure. This was the moment of recognition she had been seeking all her life. To prove to her parents that she had lived up to their expectations, that she was the successful woman they wanted her to be. "What do you think about our plans to expand the house?" she asked, turning the conversation back to housework. "We want to add another bedroom and maybe an office for Eric." "That's a great idea," Charles agreed. "The house should grow with the family." Eric nodded, but I noticed him glance in my direction. We both realized that the conversation about expanding the house was a veiled discussion of my future in this family. The extra rooms weren't needed for guests, but for the children Caroline and Eric were planning. "John, what do you think of our plans?" Cynthia suddenly turned to me. It was the first time all evening that someone had asked my opinion directly. I felt all eyes turn in my direction. "I think young people should arrange the house according to their own taste," I said cautiously. "Of course," Cynthia agreed. "Although I hope the changes won't affect the common areas. This house has such a cozy atmosphere." "Mom's right," Caroline said. "We plan to keep the basic layout, only change the lesser used areas." Lesser used spaces was what she'd called my room. I took the hint, but didn't comment. Eric caught my gaze and frowned slightly, embarrassed at my open demonstration of my eviction plans. Dinner continued, and I tried to eat carefully, mindful of Caroline's comment about shaking hands. But it was that carefulness that made me uncomfortable. As I tried to cut off a piece of duck, the knife slipped off the plate and fell to the floor with a loud clang. "I'm sorry," I said, bending down to pick up the knife. "Leave it, John," Caroline said quickly, standing up. "I'll get a clean one." There was irritation in her voice, carefully concealed by the presence of her parents. She left for the kitchen, and there was an awkward silence in the dining room. "It's nothing," Charles said, trying to lighten the mood. "It happens." "Sure," Eric agreed. "Daddy, maybe some wine?" Caroline returned with a clean knife, setting it next to my plate a little more sharply than necessary. She had a polite smile on her face, but her eyes showed displeasure. "Thank you," I said. "You're welcome," she replied, returning to her seat. The conversation resumed, but the atmosphere became more tense. Caroline glanced in my direction often, watching my every move. I felt under constant scrutiny, like a sailor on watch under the gaze of a strict chief mate. When dessert was served, homemade apple pie and ice cream, I tried to be extra cautious, but it was precisely this restraint that led to a new awkwardness. As I tried to carefully eat a piece of pie, I didn't notice a crumb fall onto the tablecloth next to my plate. "John!" Caroline said sharply when she saw it. Everyone looked at me again. I quickly brushed the crumb off with my napkin, but it was too late. The moment was ruined. "I'm sorry," I mumbled. "God," Caroline sighed, unable to help herself. "How many times can you—" "Caroline," Eric said quietly, trying to stop her. But she was at the end of her tether. All day she'd been preparing for the perfect evening, trying to make the best impression on her parents, and my awkwardness was ruining the carefully constructed picture. "No, Eric, this can't go on," she said, getting up from the table. "It's the same thing every time. Dishes falling, food spilling, crumbs everywhere." The parents watched the scene with growing discomfort. Charles put aside his fork. Cynthia pressed her lips together. They had obviously not expected such a turn of events at the holiday table. "Darling, maybe we shouldn't—" Charles began. "Yes, Papa," Caroline replied sharply. "You don't live with it every day. You don't see how it makes our lives a constant inconvenience." I sat with my hands clasped together, feeling a familiar heaviness building up inside. This was exactly what I was afraid of. Causing a family conflict, embarrassing Eric in front of his wife's parents. "Caroline, please," Eric tried to intervene. "No!" She turned to me with a face contorted with anger. "You're 73 years old. You can't eat like a normal person. You can't behave at the table." Her voice grew louder and louder, more and more hysterical. All the irritation that had built up over the months burst out at the worst possible moment. "Caroline, stop," Eric said more firmly. "You can see it," she shouted, pointing at me. "Look at him. He can't even sit up straight." And then something happened that no one expected. Caroline walked over to my chair, grabbed me by the hair on the back of my neck, and yanked me up sharply, forcing me to lift my head. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," she hissed. The pain was sharp and unexpected. At that moment, my patience broke. Get your hands off me, I said, trying to free myself. What did you say? Caroline yanked harder, and I felt tears of pain welling up in my eyes. I said, get your hands off me, I repeated louder. She let go of my hair, but the fury in her eyes only intensified. Grabbing her glass of red wine that stood nearby, she spat the contents into my face in a sharp motion. The cold wine flooded my eyes, ran down my cheeks, dripped from my chin onto my white shirt. I didn't even realize what had happened right away. I just sat there blinking, feeling the wine dripping down my face and leaving dark stains on my clothes. The dining room became dead silent. Charles and Cynthia sat with their mouths open, unable to believe what they had just seen. Eric froze with fork in hand, looking at his wife with an expression of utter shock. Caroline, he whispered. What? She snapped, still holding the empty glass. What, Eric? Are you going to protect him now? I slowly stood up from the table, feeling the wine continue to drip from my face. I pulled a handkerchief out of my pocket and began wiping my eyes without saying a word. Caroline, Cynthia said quietly, what are you doing? What I should have done a long time ago, replied her daughter, setting the glass on the table so sharply that it rattled. I finished wiping my face and looked at the crowd. Eric looked at me with horror and sympathy. Caroline's parents looked at me with shock and unconcealed disapproval of their daughter's behavior. And Caroline stood there, breathing heavily with the expression of someone who had finally said what she thought. I'm sorry, I said quietly, turning to Charles and Cynthia. I've ruined your holiday dinner. I headed for the dining room door, feeling the heavy stares. Behind me, I could hear Eric calling out to his wife, demanding an explanation, and Cynthia saying something about the inadmissibility of such behavior. But I was on my way up the stairs to my room, where I could take off my soiled shirt and think about how everything in this house was different now. The point of no return had been passed. I went up to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bed, still smelling the wine on my skin. My shirt was hopelessly ruined, dark red stains spread across the white fabric like blood on snow. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the humiliation I'd just endured. Muffled voices came from downstairs. I tried not to listen at first, but the sounds grew louder, and it wasn't hard to make out the words. The thin walls of this house didn't hold sound well, especially when people started raising their voices. Caroline, what was that? Cynthia's voice sounded harsh, with a note of indignation I'd never heard before. Mom, you don't understand. You don't live with it every day. I understand enough to know that's not how well-mannered people behave, Cynthia replied coldly, especially at the holiday table, in the presence of guests. I stood up and went to the window, but the conversation continued from the dining room. The voices were clear, each word distinct in the evening silence. Caroline, it was Charles, and he had that commanding tone of voice with which he probably spoke to his subordinates in his company. Please explain to me what just happened. Dad, I just can't take it anymore. He's lived here for 2 years now, and it's the same thing every day. The mess, the awkwardness, the constant inconvenience. And that gives you the right to grab an old man by the hair and pour wine on him? Cynthia's voice grew more and more icy. He's not just an old man, Mom. He's ruining our family life. Caroline, stop, Eric intervened. His voice sounded tired, like a man who had suddenly seen his wife from a completely unexpected angle. Don't tell me to stop, she shouted. You see what's happening every day. He drops things, spills food, prevents us from living a normal life. I took off my soiled shirt and threw it in the laundry basket. I took a clean one out of the closet, but my hands were shaking more than usual. The humiliation was worse than any physical pain. Caroline, Charles's voice became even more stern. You're talking about a 73-year-old man who had a stroke, your husband's father. I'm talking about the man who turned our house into a nursing home. Enough, Cynthia said sharply, and there was steel in her voice. Apparently, Caroline had crossed some line beyond which even maternal condescension ended. There was a pause. I put on a clean shirt, slowly buttoning the buttons. The movements were difficult. The left arm was still not fully obedient after the stroke, and the stress of what had happened was only adding to the problem. Mom, don't talk to me that way. Caroline's voice became less confident. I'll talk to you in any tone I want as long as you act like a rude girl. Cynthia replied. What you just did is unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. Cynthia's right, Charles supported her. Ashern, we didn't raise you to humiliate the elderly. But you don't understand. We understand more than you think, Charles interrupted her. We realize that our daughter has just shown her true face, and it's a face we don't like. I went to the bathroom and washed my face with cold water. The mirror reflected a tired old man with red eyes. I washed away the traces of wine, but the humiliation remained somewhere deeper, somewhere that water couldn't reach. The voices downstairs continued, and now Eric was actively engaged in the conversation. Caroline, I can't believe what you did. Eric, don't. You see how hard life is for us. Difficult? His voice got a little higher. My father's 73. He's had a stroke. He needs care. And you think that's a problem? Eric, that's not what I meant. What did you mean when you pulled his hair? What did you mean when you poured wine on him? Silence. Apparently, Caroline couldn't find anything to say. I went back to the bedroom and sat in the chair by the window. The snow was still falling, covering the world with a white calm that contrasted with the storm in the house. Caroline, Cynthia spoke again, and now there was not only condemnation but disappointment in her voice. Where did you learn such behavior? Not in our house. Mother? No, answer me. Where have you seen well-mannered people treat family members like this? He's not a member of our family, Caroline blurted out. He's a burden that's keeping us from living. The words sounded like a judgment. I closed my eyes, feeling something finally break inside. A burden. That's how she saw me. That's what I'd been in her eyes for the past 2 years. Caroline Harrison. Charles' voice turned icy as he called his daughter by her maiden name, which apparently meant something serious. You just said some things you can't take back. Dad, I just wanted to... You wanted to humiliate an old man who trusted your family. You wanted to show your power over a defenseless man. He's not defenseless. He's what? Eric interrupted her. Is he old and sick? Does he sometimes drop his fork or spill his coffee? And for that, you think it's okay to treat him like an animal? Eric's voice sounded as if he was seeing his wife for the first time. It was the shock of a man who had discovered that he had been living with a complete stranger for several years. Eric, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. What pressure? Cynthia asked. The pressure to be human? Mom, that's easy to say when you don't live in the same house. We lived in the same house as your father's grandfather for the last 5 years of his life, Cynthia replied sharply. He was confined to a chair, hardly spoke, required constant care, and it never occurred to any of us to treat him the way you're treating John. 5 years. They took care of a sick old man for 5 years, and it didn't break them, didn't turn them into cruel people. And Caroline couldn't handle 2 years of living with a man who just needed understanding. It was different. It was no different, Charles said stiffly. Except that we had the education and humanity to treat old age with respect. Education and humanity. Obviously, something in Caroline's upbringing had gone wrong, or she just hadn't learned the lessons her parents had tried to teach her. Caroline, Eric spoke again, and I heard a new note in his voice. I need time to think about what happened. What do you mean, think about it? It means that I don't know how to live with a man who is capable of such cruelty. Eric, don't be so dramatic. Dramatic? His voice has risen. You poured wine on my father. You pulled his hair. You call that dramatic? Eric, I was upset. I didn't mean... You didn't mean to what? Humiliate him. Show my parents that you think my father is trash? The silence dragged on. Apparently, even Caroline was beginning to realize the magnitude of what had happened, or at least beginning to realize that her behavior had consequences she hadn't foreseen. Darling, Cynthia finally spoke, and there was weariness in her voice. Father and I are very disappointed, very much disappointed. Mom, we thought we'd raised a good, decent girl, and now we've raised... Cynthia's voice broke. Raised what? Caroline asked quietly. A selfish girl, Charles finished for his wife. A cruel, selfish woman who thought only of her own comfort. The words sounded like a whiplash. I pictured Caroline's face at that moment. She wasn't used to her parents talking to her like that. Dad, it's not fair. Unfair? Charles seemed to lose his temper. What's fair? The way you treated John. I think we should leave, Cynthia said. Tonight. Mother, no. It's Christmas. What Christmas, Caroline? After what happened? Do you think we can sit at the same table with a man who would do such a thing? That's my wife, Eric interjected, but there was no defense in his voice, just a statement of fact. It's still yours, Charles answered coldly. But after tonight, I'm not sure it's for the best. The phrase sounded like a prediction. Caroline's parents not only disapproved of their daughter's behavior, they questioned the appropriateness of her marriage to Eric. We're packing, Cynthia said, and we're leaving in the morning. Mom, please, let's talk. Talk? Talk about what? About how you humiliated an old man? About how you showed your true colors? I heard someone get up from the table, dishes clinking. Apparently dinner was finally over. Charles, Eric said, maybe we should wait until morning. Give everyone time to calm down? The time to calm down was before your wife decided to make a circus at the holiday table, Charles answered. It's too late to change anything now. The sound of footsteps heading for the stairs. Caroline's parents were coming up to pack. I heard Caroline try to say something, but there was only silence. Then I heard Eric and his wife talking, but they were talking quieter now, and it was hard to make out the words. All I could make out was that the tone of their conversation was cold, detached, like a conversation between strangers forced to deal with common problems. About midnight, the house finally quieted down. I sat like that in my chair, looking out the window at the falling snow. Christmas had been ruined, family destroyed, relationships fractured, and it was all because I dropped my knife and scattered crumbs on the tablecloth. Although, of course, it wasn't about the knife and the crumbs. It was about something that had been building up for months, maybe years. The impatience that Caroline had learned to hide but could not conquer. The ideas of what a perfect family should be, and the unwillingness to accept a reality where there was room for weakness and frailty. Tomorrow, I realized, everything would change. Caroline's parents would leave, taking with them not only their disappointment in their daughter, but also a new perspective on her marriage, on her character, on her future. And in this house will remain people who now know the truth about each other. The morning of December 25th, I met without sleeping a wink. All through the night, I heard muffled voices in the house, footsteps in the hallway, and the sound of suitcases being packed. Caroline's parents were about to leave, but the process was dragging on. Apparently, there were serious conversations going on between them. Around 7 in the morning, I heard the guest room door open, and the voices of Charles and Cynthia could be heard in the hallway. They spoke softly, but in the morning silence, every word was clearly audible. No, Charles, I can't just turn a blind eye to this, Cynthia said. What she did last night was not just an outburst of anger. It's an indication of character. I agree. The question is what we can do. Anyway, we can show her that this behavior has consequences, serious consequences. I got out of bed, walked to the door. Their conversation was about Caroline's future, and therefore indirectly my future in this house. Cynthia, you realize this is our only daughter. That's why we have to act. If we remain silent now, we become complicit in this behavior. Charles was silent for a moment. Apparently, he was thinking over his wife's words, weighing all aspects of the situation. What do you suggest? I think it's time to show Caroline what it means to take responsibility for her actions. Real responsibility. Their footsteps headed for the stairs, and I realized that the crucial conversation would take place over breakfast. I quickly washed my face, got dressed, and went down to the kitchen. I wanted to make myself some coffee before the family drama continued, but Caroline was already in the kitchen. She was standing by the window with a cup in her hands, still in her housecoat, but looking like she'd been up all night. Her face was pale, dark circles under her eyes, her hair disheveled. Yesterday's impeccable hostess had turned into a tired woman who was beginning to realize the magnitude of what had happened. At my appearance, she turned around. An expression flashed across her face that was a mixture of shame, annoyance, and confusion. John, she said quietly. But she didn't have time to finish. Her parents entered the kitchen, fully dressed for the road. Charles wore a dark suit, Cynthia an elegant coat. They looked like business people who had arrived to attend to important matters. Not going to worry. Good morning, John, Charles said, nodding at me. There was no warmth or coldness in his tone, just politeness. Good morning, I replied. Cynthia said hello too, but her gaze went straight to her daughter. There was the determination of someone ready for a difficult conversation. Caroline, we need to talk, she said. Mom, I know what happened yesterday. Sit down, please, Charles interrupted her, pointing to a chair at the kitchen table. Caroline sat down, folding her hands in her lap. Her parents remained standing. It created the atmosphere of a formal conversation, where decisions were made by those who were standing and listened to those who were sitting. I wanted to leave so as not to disturb the family conversation, but Charles gestured for me to stay. John, please stay. What we are about to say concerns you as well. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat in the far corner of the kitchen, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. Caroline, Cynthia began, your father and I have been thinking all night about what happened last night. Mother, I realize that I was wrong. Don't interrupt me, Cynthia said sternly. We weren't just thinking about your behavior, but what it says about your character, about your values, about who we've raised. Caroline lowered her head, looking at her hands. She was apparently beginning to realize that this conversation wasn't just going to be a reprimand, but something more serious. We've spent 20 years trying to get you the best education, Charles continued. Sent you to the best schools, paid for university, taught you the principles of morality and humanity. Dad. And last night we saw the result. We saw our daughter humiliate a defenseless elderly man, pulling his hair like a naughty child, pouring wine on him like an enemy. Charles's voice was becoming increasingly harsh. Apparently a night of reflection had only strengthened him in the decision he and his wife had made. It wasn't an outburst of anger, Caroline, Cynthia said. It was a display of your true attitude towards people who don't meet your standards of convenience. Mom, I was under stress. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean what? Cynthia interrupted her. Show us who you really are? Caroline raised her head and I saw tears appear in her eyes. Not tears of remorse, but the tears of someone who is beginning to realize that things are getting out of control. Parents, I know what I did was wrong. I'm ready to apologize to John. Apologize, Charles repeated bitterly. Do you think that apologizing can erase the humiliation you caused that man? I'm ready to make it right. No, Caroline, Cynthia said. Some things can't be undone. You can only take responsibility for them. There was silence in the kitchen. Caroline looked at her mother and father, trying to figure out where the conversation was going. What do you mean? She asked at last. We mean that, as of today, you are no longer working for our company, Charles said. The words sounded like a lightning strike. Caroline turned even paler, her mouth hanging open in shock. What? What did you say? You're fired, Charles repeated. We can't trust a key position in the company to a man of such moral character. Dad, you can't. This is a family business. It's because it's a family business that we can't allow its reputation to be tarnished by a man capable of such cruelty, Cynthia replied. Caroline stood up, pacing the kitchen. Her movements showed the panic of a person who had suddenly realized the magnitude of the catastrophe. You can't do this. I've been with the company for 5 years. I've been doing great. Professional qualities are not everything, Charles said. Character is more important, and your character, as it turns out, leaves a lot to be desired. It's not fair. Because of one incident, you're ruining my career? One incident. Cynthia looked at her daughter with surprise. Do you think what happened yesterday was an accident? Of course it was. I was under stress, working hard. Stress doesn't turn normal people into sadists, Charles said stiffly. Stress manifests what's already inside. Caroline stopped, rested her hands on the kitchen counter. Her breathing was frequent, shallow. All right, she said, trying to pull herself together. Oh, suppose you fire me. But that doesn't mean... It does, Cynthia interrupted her. It also means that you are no longer heir to our fortune. If the first blow had been hard, the second was crushing. Caroline turned to her parents with an expression of utter disbelief. What did you say? We're changing our will, Cynthia replied calmly. Our entire fortune will be given to charitable organizations dedicated to helping the elderly. You can't. I'm your only daughter. You were our only daughter, Charles said, until last night. Now you're just someone who carries our family name, but doesn't share our values. Caroline grabbed the chair, as if she needed support to keep from falling. Dad, Mom, you can't make these decisions out of emotion. We don't make decisions out of emotion, Cynthia replied. We make decisions based on facts. The fact is that you humiliated a defenseless man. The fact is that you showed no remorse, only excuses. But I am remorseful. I'm ready to change. People don't change at 34, Charles said. They just learn to hide their true nature better. Caroline sank down in her chair and covered her face with her hands. Now she was crying for real, the tears of despair of a person who had suddenly lost everything she thought was guaranteed. Mom, she whispered through her tears, I'm your daughter. You can't do this to me. It is because you are my daughter that I have to do this, Cynthia replied, and there was pain in her voice for the first time in this conversation. Depurm, if I do not show you the consequences of your actions, I shall be an accomplice to your cruelty. Caroline, Charles added, we hope that in time you will realize the rightness of our decision, that it will help you become a better person. Better? She raised her head, and in her eyes I saw anger instead of tears. You ruined my life and you call that parenting? We're showing you that there is responsibility in this world, Charles replied. Something we apparently failed to teach you as a child. Caroline stood up and wiped away her tears. The expression I'd seen on her face the day before, the cold determination of someone ready to fight. All right, she said, if you choose to punish me, then punish me. But don't think I'll apologize for telling the truth. What truth? Cynthia asked. The truth that he, she pointed to me, is really a burden. The truth that his presence in this house is destroying our family. The truth that I'm tired of living with an invalid. Those words sounded like a slap in the face. Handicapped is what she called me in front of my parents, without hesitation. Charles and Cynthia looked at each other, and I realized that the last doubts about their decision were gone. Now we know for sure we did the right thing, Cynthia said. Goodbye, Caroline. Mom, goodbye. When you learn to be human, maybe we can talk again. But not before. The parents headed for the kitchen exit. Charles turned to me at the door. John, please accept our apologies for the behavior of this man. And know that if you ever need help, you can count on us. They left, leaving Caroline standing in the middle of the kitchen with a face contorted with rage and despair. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of a car pulling away. Caroline's parents were leaving the house, taking with them not only their disappointment in their daughter, but also her future, her job, her money, her inheritance, her social status, all the things she had built her life for. And in the house remained a woman who suddenly realized that one night she lost everything she considered hers by right. There was a heavy silence in the house after her parents left. Caroline stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring out the window at the empty driveway where her father's car had been a few minutes ago. Her posture read the numbness of someone who couldn't believe what was happening. I finished my coffee and stood up quietly, intending to walk away and leave her to her thoughts. But a voice stopped me at the door. Happy? She asked without turning around. What? I said, are you happy with the result? I turned around. Caroline was still staring out the window, but there was such anger in her voice that the air in the kitchen was almost palpably heavy. Caroline, I don't understand. You don't understand. She turned sharply toward me, and I saw a face contorted with rage. 2 years you lived in that house. 2 years you waited for the moment when you could take revenge on me for telling you the truth. Affirm, I didn't take revenge on anyone. You didn't? Who was acting out yesterday to cause a scandal? Who purposely dropped things, spilled things, crumbled things? Her accusations were so unfair that I didn't even know what to say. She seriously thought my awkwardness was a deliberate attempt to compromise her. Caroline, I was just trying to have dinner. Just trying to have dinner. She laughed, but it was an angry, hysterical laugh. Of course you were. Accidentally dropped the knife, accidentally scattered the crumbs, accidentally put me in a state where I couldn't control myself. You pulled my hair and poured wine on me, I said quietly. That was your choice. My choice? Caroline stepped closer to me, the fire of real hatred burning in her eyes. Huh? My choice was to put up with you for 2 years. My choice was to keep quiet when you turned my house into a nursing home. This is my son's house. No, this is my house. A home that I set up, that I pay for, that I wanted to start a family in. And you ruined it. She was screaming now, unrestrained, venting all the anger she had accumulated over the years. The sound of the front door silenced her. Eric was back. Hi, he said, entering the kitchen. Did Caroline's parents leave already? I saw their car in the driveway. He stopped when he saw our faces. Caroline stood with her fists clenched in anger, and I stood with an expression of exhaustion and pain. What's going on? Eric asked. Ask your father, Caroline hissed. Ask him how he got my parents to strip me of everything. What are you talking about? Huh. They fired me, Eric. They fired me from the family company and disinherited me. Eric turned pale, slumped in his chair. He realized what this meant. Caroline had lost not only her job, but also the financial prospects on which their life together had been built. How had this happened? They said they couldn't trust key positions to someone with my moral fiber, Caroline said sarcastically, mimicking her father's tone. But for what? For last night? For daring to show the truth about their precious John? For saying out loud what they didn't want to hear? Eric looked at me, then back at his wife. His eyes read the confusion of a man trying to understand the logic of what was happening. Caroline, what you did yesterday, what did I do? What exactly did I do that was so terrible? You humiliated my father in front of guests on Christmas night. I showed my attitude to a situation I could no longer tolerate. Caroline started pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. Her movements were so furious that she seemed ready to lash out at anyone she could get her hands on. 2 years, Eric. 2 years I lived with a strange old man in my own house. 2 years I have endured his awkwardness, his illness, his constant presence. He's my father, Eric said quietly. So what? That gives him the right to ruin our lives? Stop us from building a family? He doesn't stop us from building a family. He's not. Carolyn stopped in front of her husband. How can we have children with a sick old man living in the house? How can I feel like a hostess when every day I see a reminder that this is not my home? Caroline, you're saying terrible things. I'm telling the truth you're afraid to admit. She sat down across from her husband, leaning toward him. There was a pleading note in her voice, but her eyes still burned with anger. Eric, look at it honestly. Has our life gotten better since he's been living here? Are we happier? Dad needs our help. There are many ways to help. There are good nursing homes. There are caregivers. Why does he have to live here? Because he's my father and I love him. Do you love me? Caroline grabbed her husband's hands. Or is your love for your father more important than your love for your wife? Eric was silent, and that silence spoke more eloquently than words about his inner struggle. He loved his father, but he also loved his wife. Last night had confronted him with a choice he was not prepared to make. Eric, Caroline continued, my parents took everything from me. My job, my money, my future. And for what? Because I defended our marriage. You weren't protecting our marriage, Eric said. You were humiliating a sick old man. A sick old man. She jumped up. You're on his side too. I'm not taking sides. I'm just trying to understand how my wife could do that. How could I? How could I do otherwise? How much more silence and patience can I take? Caroline started pacing the kitchen again, and her speech became hysterical. You don't know what it's like to live in constant tension, watching his every move, cleaning up after him, putting up with his senile habits. What senile habits? I asked, unable to bear it. You don't know, she turned to me. You leave your things everywhere, drop food, shuffle your feet at night. I try not to interfere. You're trying to stay out of the way? You're a nuisance by your very existence in this house. Caroline, Eric said sharply. What, Caroline? Do you want me to keep quiet? To smile and pretend that everything is fine? Shannon? I want you to be human, Eric said, steel in his voice. Human? Caroline laughed. Was it human to force a young woman to live in a nursing home? Is it human to demand that I give up a normal family life for someone else's grandfather? Someone else's grandfather? Eric stood up. That's my father. And my enemy, Caroline shouted. The enemy of my happiness, my family, my future. The words hung in the air like a sentence. Caroline was declaring war, with no intention of retreating or compromising. Caroline, Eric said slowly, do you realize what you're saying? I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying I'm tired of pretending, tired of playing the role of the caring daughter-in-law. I'm tired of sacrificing my life for his convenience. No one asked you to sacrifice your life. No? Then what is it? What does it mean to live in a house where the husband is not in charge, but his sick father? Where all decisions are made with the old man in mind. Eric sat back in his chair and covered his face with his hands. Apparently, he was beginning to realize that his wife had not just snapped in an emotional outburst. She had revealed to him her true attitude to their family life. I thought you accepted Dad as a member of the family, he said quietly. I accepted him as a temporary inconvenience. I thought it was for a few months, a year at the most. 2 years have passed, and there's no end in sight. The end of what? His life in our house, Caroline shouted, and it sounded like a slap in the face. I felt a chill go through me. She was openly saying that she was waiting for me to die, that she thought my existence was an obstacle to her happiness. Caroline, Eric whispered, you can't say things like that. I can, because it's true, because I won't lie and pretend anymore. She went to the window, leaned against the sill. Her posture was tired, but not from physical exertion, from the need to hide her true feelings. Silworm, do you know what the worst thing is? She said without turning around. That I lost everything because of him. The job I loved, the money I counted on, the respect of my parents. You lost that because of your behavior, not because of Dad. My behavior was a reaction to an intolerable situation. She turned to her husband. Any man in my position would have snapped. No, Caroline. Any man would have found another way to solve the problem. What other way? What way, Eric? I've tried everything. Hinting, talking, begging. Nothing works. You never talked to me openly about it, because I knew you'd choose him, just like you're choosing him now. Eric stood up, walked over to his wife. His face showed the pain of a man who had realized that his marriage had been built on lies and misunderstandings. Shronadillo. Caroline, I'm not choosing between you. I just can't throw a sick old man out on the street. But you can ruin your wife's life, she replied coldly. Nobody ruined your life. You ruined it yourself when you showed your true colors. The words struck Caroline like a blow. She pulled away from her husband, and I saw something new in her eyes, the realization that even Eric wasn't on her side anymore. So that's it, she said quietly. So you think I'm guilty too. I think what you did was wrong, and that you refuse to admit it. What do you expect? For me to get down on my knees in front of him and beg for forgiveness? I expect you to admit your mistake and try to fix it. Caroline looked at her husband for a long moment. There was disappointment, anger, and something else in that look. Perhaps the realization that her world had finally collapsed. All right, Eric, she said at last. Now I know whose side you're on. And she walked out of the kitchen, leaving us alone with the sound of her footsteps on the stairs and the slamming of the bedroom door. Eric stood at the window, staring out at nothing. His shoulders were heavy with the weight of a man who realized his family was falling apart and nothing could be undone. After Caroline left, Eric and I sat in the kitchen in silence for a long time. He was staring out the window at the snowy yard, and I was fumbling with my empty mug. The silence was heavy, filled with the realization that what had happened had changed our lives forever. Around noon, Eric finally spoke. Dad, there's something I have to tell you. I looked up. His voice had the determination of a man who had made a difficult but necessary decision. I'm listening, son. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, what Caroline said, how she acted, and I realized I no longer know the man I married. Eric stood up, paced the kitchen. The tiredness of a man who'd spent a sleepless night weighing arguments and trying to find a solution that didn't exist was evident in his movements. You know, Dad, I thought she was just tired, that she needed time to adjust. For 2 years, I convinced myself that her coldness towards you was just a temporary thing, that things would gradually get better. Eric, I realize that my illness is making it difficult. No, he interrupted me. Your illness doesn't create difficulties. It's the lack of humanity that creates difficulties. He sat back down, looked me in the eye. There was pain in his gaze, but also the relief of a man who finally saw the situation clearly. I saw the real Caroline last night. Not the woman she pretended to be in front of me, but the woman she was with you when I wasn't home. I remembered the countless petty humiliations of the last 2 years, the barbed remarks, the cold stares, the feeling that I was living in a house on a bird's license. Eric only saw the tip of the iceberg. Son, I don't want to be the reason your marriage is broken. You're not the reason, Dad. The reason is that I married a man who turned out to be capable of cruelty to the defenseless. The sound of footsteps on the stairs silenced us. Caroline was coming downstairs, and I knew from the sound that she was carrying suitcases. She walked into the kitchen in her traveling clothes, hair gathered, makeup applied. She looked like a businesswoman going on a business trip, but her eyes betrayed an inner tension. I'm going to my friend Sarah's, she said, turning to Eric. I need time to think about my plans. Okay, Eric answered calmly. Okay. She looked at him with surprise. Your wife is leaving home and you say, okay? Caroline, after what happened, I think we really need time to think about our relationship. She set the suitcase on the floor and sat down at the table across from her husband. Her face read the hope that the separation would make Eric reconsider his position. Eric, I know I acted a little harsh, but you know the state I was in. I do, and that's what scares me. What do you mean? That you still think your behavior is justified, that you don't see anything wrong with it. Caroline paused, apparently trying to find the words to change the situation. If I apologize to your father, would that change anything? Are you ready to apologize? If it will save our marriage, yes. Eric looked at her for a long moment, and in that look I read disappointment. She wasn't offering an apology out of remorse, but as a bargain, as a way to get back what she'd lost. Caroline, an apology should come from the heart, not from a desire to make things right. What difference does it make if the outcome is the same? It makes a huge difference, because it shows if you've changed as a person. She got up, started walking around the kitchen. Her movements showed the impatience of a person who had to explain the obvious, from her point of view things. Eric, let's be practical. Yes, I snapped. Yes, it was ugly. But is that any reason to break up a 5-year marriage? It's not about the fact that you snapped. It's about how you treat people who are weaker than you. People who make it hard for me to live. The words came out of her mouth involuntarily, and she realized at once that she had said too much. You see, Eric said quietly, you haven't changed. You still think Dad is the problem, not your attitude toward him. Caroline sank down in her chair and covered her face with her hands. She sat in silence for a few minutes, and I thought that maybe she finally realized what she was saying. All right, she said at last. Suppose you're right. Suppose I was cruel. What do you want? For me to change? I want you to realize you were wrong. I want you to really understand, not just agree to save the marriage. And if I do? I don't know, Caroline. I honestly don't know. Eric stood up, walked to the window. He had aged several years in 2 days, his face wrinkled, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his decisions. Sunoi, you know what the worst part is? He said without turning around. That I'm beginning to wonder if I've really known you all these years. Eric, a man who can grab a sick old man by the hair doesn't become like that in a day. It means you've always been violent. I just haven't seen it. That's not true. Then where did it come from? Did you wake up yesterday and suddenly decide to become violent? Caroline didn't answer. She realized that she had backed herself into a corner of logic from which there was no escape. I have to go, she said at last, rising. Yes, that would probably be best. She picked up her suitcase and headed for the door. She stopped at the door and looked back. Eric, if I leave now, is it over? He turned to her. There was pain in his eyes, but also determination. I don't know, Caroline. But I do know that I can't live with a man who thinks my concern for my father is an obstacle to happiness. What if your father? You know, if circumstances change? I see what she's talking about. If I died or went into a nursing home, Would that make room for their family happiness? Caroline, Eric said tiredly, if you still don't understand what the problem is, it's useless to explain. She nodded, opened the door. Cold air rushed into the kitchen, bringing with it the smell of snow and the approaching evening. I'll call you when I'm settled in, she said. Good. The door closed, and a few minutes later we heard the sound of a car pulling away. Caroline was leaving the house she thought was hers, taking with her the remnants of a marriage built on misunderstandings and hidden cruelty. Eric came back to the table, sitting across from me. We sat in silence, listening to the silence of a house from which the woman who had defined its atmosphere for the past 5 years had left. Dad, he said at last, I have something to tell you. What is it, son? I'm filing for divorce. I'm going to see a lawyer next week. The words came as no surprise, but they still made me wince. Divorce meant a final breakup, the end of any hope of reconciliation. Are you sure? Yes, Dad. I realized I couldn't trust a man capable of such cruelty. And most of all, I can't forgive the way she treated you. Son, don't destroy your family because of me. I'm not destroying my family, Dad. A family was destroyed by a man who couldn't accept all of its members. Eric stood up, hugged me. Tight, a real hug, like he hadn't hugged me in a long time. You know what I've realized these days? When he said that a real family isn't one where everything is comfortable and pretty. A real family is one where people take care of each other, no matter how hard things get. Thank you, son. For what? For being a human being, for not letting circumstances make you cruel. We sat in the kitchen, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt like home again. Not a spotless museum where every crumb was a crime, but a place where people could be themselves. Weak, awkward, in need of care. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white peace. Christmas didn't end as planned, but perhaps it was exactly how it should have ended. The truth came to the surface. The mask fell, and people had to show who they really were. Caroline lost everything: her job, her money, her husband, her home. But the most important thing she lost was the right to be called a person capable of compassion. Eric lost his wife, but he gained clarity about what a real relationship should be. And I gained confidence that my son didn't just love me out of a sense of duty, but truly considered me part of his family. A family that is now less about numbers, but more about humanity. In the evening, we cooked a simple dinner, sitting at the same table where the life-changing drama had played out 2 days earlier. But now there was no tension at the table, no stares full of animosity, no sense that anyone was an extra. You know, Dad, Eric said, pouring the tea, I think we'll be fine together, at least for a while. I think you're right, son. Outside the window, the snow had turned into a light blizzard, but the house was warm and quiet. We talked about plans for the next year, about setting up life anew, about the possibility of traveling, which Caroline had always thought inappropriate for someone my age. Late at night, going up to my room, I thought about how sometimes to gain happiness, you have to lose what seemed to be its foundation. Caroline was beautiful, intelligent, successful, the perfect wife by many standards. But she lacked the essentials, the ability to love more than just herself. In my room, I stared out the window at the snow-covered yard for a long time. Somewhere in the city at that very minute, Caroline was trying to explain to a friend why her marriage had broken up. Probably telling her about the ungrateful father-in-law who had ruined her happiness, the husband who had chosen his father over his wife, the parents who didn't understand her. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. She lost everything because she showed her true face at the critical moment. The face of a person for whom her own convenience is more important than human dignity. And in this house remained what really matters: the love of a son for his father, the willingness to take care of each other, the understanding that family is not only a joy, but also a responsibility that Caroline couldn't accept and that ultimately ruined her life. As I fell asleep peacefully for the first time in many months, I knew tomorrow would be a new day in a home where I was no longer considered a burden, a home where I was once again just a father, loved and accepted for who he was.